Well, what's up, Calvary family? Welcome back to the Midweek Podcast. This is episode 4 of this podcast. How you feel after 4 episodes, or 3 episodes, I guess?
Well, I'm all for it, Jake. Let's keep moving forward.
That's good. Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us again for this week. We're talking about unity in community this week. We're talking about communion. We're talking about division. We're talking about all kinds of things like that were problems in the Corinthian church, and Paul had to say, hey, get with it. What do you think?
I think, what better place to really acknowledge and express the difficulties of division, especially than a church like Corinth, because there were so many divisions, there were so many things going on there, and a lot of people just struggling, trying to figure out what they can, what they can't do, and Paul is correcting them appropriately. And especially as, to the church service, when he's describing and talking about the disunity that's taking place, we often can look back at the old church, right, and say, oh, that was back then, but then you look at kind of some of the issues, and I laugh, and I'm like, oh, dang, yeah.
Yeah, no, these are the same things.
These are the same things that still divide us today, that get people hot under the collar and just get really mad and frustrated. So.
It's like what we've been talking about. People don't change.
Right.
People don't change. The problems stay the same. The dates are different, and maybe the geographic location's different, but people don't change. Yeah.
So what have you experienced as it pertains, not necessarily with this church or just church in general, or churches you've been a part of, where you've seen unity appropriately or disunity?
Well, I've been through 2 church splits where I think 2, it's just 2. I've seen just a small church where a pastor said, a lot of people care more about the church building than they care about the people. Now, mind you, he did in the message make an example of it in quite an audacious way, where he took a sledgehammer and didn't actually hit anything. But this was like one of those, not old-fashioned churches, but like built in the 70s, has the stained glass windows kinds of things. And so he picked up a sledgehammer and swung at one of the walls and stopped about 3 inches short and said, a lot of people in church will care more about that than they will about homeless people, or they will about sharing the gospel. His point stands, but the deacons of that church took it the wrong way, and division happened. And so I got to witness that. I got to witness the church split that a lot of us here at Calvary dealt with about 4 years ago. And then I've seen an interesting level, and here we go with the hot topics, in Calvary as a movement, the split that took place there. And I've seen the division that has caused, and I've also seen some interesting unity come out of that. Some people that are like, we don't want to fight. What if we didn't fight? What if we just were people? So I don't know. Those are the 3 big examples that I can see or have seen.
I've never really seen it like on that level, but I've always seen like a slow burn at certain churches where everything appears on the surface like everything's okay, right, but there's still like disunity, even like within the church. You know what I mean? Oh yeah. It's not like it ended bad and there was a church split or whatever. No, I've seen churches where people disagree with what the pastor's doing. I've seen people irritated with other sheep within the church, and just it's almost like an uncomfortable, there's a division, there's like issues there, but no one's talking about it. And so that was kind of my goal. Not that this church has that issue per se, but I think the church in general has that issue, in the fact that no one's talking about it. No one talks about the fact that people are so confident, not just confident, but comfortable being separate within the same house. And, and I think Paul is addressing it the appropriate way and just saying, no, don't do that. Even here in the middle of the book, he's kind of calling out a lot of stuff, but the bigger issue is just y'all are divided, and that's not good. Yeah.
And I mean, divisions in the church today can be things as simple as people don't like one worship style versus another worship style. But also, like we're saying, people don't change. We could still have these same issues that were happening in Corinth, which was just different cultures mixing, rich people, poor people, slaves, not slaves, all of this kinds of stuff, class gender, all these things mixing
Right.
and not mixing together well. And they're still being just like, well, I'm better than you because I'm this. Even if you're not consciously thinking that, those things still creep into the church today.
Absolutely. But again, like Paul says, should I commend you? Absolutely not. No, I'm not going to
No.
commend you in this. This is absolutely wrong. And then as it pertains to, unity, what do you think the solution is?
I mean, I can be biblical and I can be broad and I can say, well, the solution, Anthony, is communion because that's what's in the chapter. That's what we're talking about. But honestly speaking, I think at some point, it's going to sound super churchy, but it is humility. It is understanding our place. It's understanding who we are in the sight of God and who everyone else is in the sight of God, and that there's no possible way for anybody in the church to be better than anybody else. That's just not the way that it works in context of like salvation, in context of Jesus and who he is. And so I don't know. I feel like the solution is just, it's communication. It's communication, and it's love, and it's assuming, I think, that, or at least trying to assume that nobody's trying to upset you. No one's trying to do anything to do that, unless they are. But I don't know.
Well, and even that like slow burn, I think people's attitudes can just get the better of them, and then
Yeah.
they start judging people. I said from the pulpit, G.K. Chesterton quote, he said, never remove a fence without asking first why it was put there,
Yeah.
And I've always applied it with never judge a Christian without actually going and getting to know them or see what's wrong or
Yeah.
whatever. And I think part of that is humility, like what you said, but the other part is just, taking the time to really like stop thinking about yourself and thinking about the other person. Earlier in the chapters, actually, Paul is dealing with this idea of legalism.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he's talking about is the fact that, just because you get to, should you? And
Yeah.
because you get to, or should you, you've got to also think of like, well, whether this is going to cause a brother to stumble or not.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
and I think we don't do that anymore. We often think like, I get to, so I'm gonna do it. And even like the whole unity thing, it's like, I don't even think we're like being unified under the right things. I've said it before, like the church is absolutely known more about what they're against than actually what they're for.
No, you're right. Yeah. And I think that just creates barriers between us and the people that we're trying to reach.
Right. And as it pertains to like a vision series, I think the biggest goal that we're trying to do is have an impact in the world, in the community.
Right.
But the cool thing is that it's kind of going backwards. We're kind of looking out and like how we're going to have an effect on the community, but then kind of taking a step back by saying, in order for that to work, we need to start here first.
Yeah.
Let's stop looking so much out there and like now start examining ourselves and saying, okay, where am I at in this whole thing? How can I have an impact without actually, with getting my house in order in a sense,
Yeah.
and making sure that I'm in the right. So it kind of starts in the church. It starts here.
Yeah.
And actually I'll go as far as to say that it doesn't just start here at the church, but, I'd like to challenge people like, it starts in the home. Is there unity even within the home? And so because there's not unity there, it spills out to the church, and then it spills out into the community, and we see what's happening now.
No, absolutely. And we had a week long, a refresh week last year at the end of 2021. And one of our guest speakers came and he spoke about unity. And one of the big things that I took away from his talk was that unity has to start on the inside of each person, just dealing with the gripes and grievances we might have against somebody else, as small as they might be, because those things can grow into bigger things.
It's actually funny that you mentioned that particular talk, because that pastor, I only made it to one refresh session. It was that one.
And it was that one.
And I remember like the thing that really spoke out to me on that particular thing is, for those listening, John Duncan over at Gateway did a teaching here, and he basically uses this illustration of a what do you call it? A target. There it is.
Oh, okay.
A target. And he's like painting the picture of like throwing the darts, shooting the arrow, and like where in the target is it going to land?
Yeah.
These are the three things that we should care about, and then all the things on the outside are just kind of minimal and secondary at best. And I've never thought of it that way. Like, yes, we should be hitting the bullseyes and be unified there. And then our way working out is like, the secondary things. But at the same time, those are the things people care more about.
Yeah, and I think that comes just from being a Christian for a while, is that you get almost complacent with the bullseyes.
Right.
Because we know them all the time. We talk about them all the time. We know that these are the core things. And so it becomes like, I'm not saying that this happens to everybody, but it can become where we're like, okay, yes, we know the gospel. Let's talk about something else, even though that's not what we should be doing, like what we're saying. And so I feel like that can be why people want to talk about the outside issues more than the bullseye ones. Yeah.
Interesting.
So what do you think Paul is meaning whenever he's talking about unity and disunity, and then he brings this idea of communion into it?
Well, because I think the biggest issue here is the fact that, they're coming and gathering together as a church, and they're communing with the Lord as a church, right? And this picture of communion is one of those, it's one of the sacred things. It's one of the two things that Jesus specifically gives instruction to the believers, to the Christian church, and that is baptism and communion. Right. And it's not, and again, he takes it so serious enough to the point where, like, the bigger issue is that you can't take this cup, you can't take this bread if you guys are disunified. He would even go on to say, like, when you come to the temple to sacrifice, leave your sacrifice at the altar and go and get right with the person you have an issue with. And even like the night before he's dying, in the garden, right? John 17, the famous prayer, he basically is talking and wishing how they would be unified, how they'd be one, as my Father and I are one. And as the classic saying goes, when you're on your deathbed, oftentimes, like, the most important things kind of come to light. Right. And one of the most important things that is coming to light is Jesus is talking about, and I think he knew that it would be an issue later on. Sure. It's just this disunity, and he's encouraging people to come together, and to come together for the right reasons. And when we come as a church and remember Jesus and take communion and all that, it's easy to kind of turn this into something stale, something that you just do.
Right. And I mean, I grew up in churches where we took communion every single week. Communion was a part of the service every week. There was never a break. There was never, and I don't want to say there was never any thought put into it, but it was the same thing every single week growing up. It was somebody in the church will get up and share a devo about communion real quick, and then they'll do it. And then offering was next. Offering was a set time in the service. Someone gets up and shares a devo on giving, and then they pass the plate. So it was like those two things became very monotonous and very, quote unquote, not special. Not necessarily intentionally, but it was just like, we do this all of the time, every single week. We have a set schedule for how we do it, and it's almost like we don't have to think about it. Right. There it is,
So there's like a repetitiveness that can often just turn into, you just do it just 'cause.
Yeah.
So where do you think the intimacy, the sacredness, is lacking or needs to be reintroduced?
Well, I just feel like communion, it's another situation of providing an environment for worship in that manner, and not just to be like, okay, cool, here's a weird concoction of chemicals that we call a wafer in these COVID safe communion things. Right. And here's a little thing of juice. Tell Jesus thanks for dying. Pop it back, and now you're done. We were actually talking about that as the worship team afterward. That when we're on stage, it's kind of difficult to take communion with everybody because we could be playing. And so on Sunday, some of the worship team saved their communion to get to go off and pray later afterward, instead of just dumping it real quick at the end of the service and being like, "Cool, I did it." And so I don't know. I just think it just deserves time. It deserves time to think, instead of just having to, and instead of just running by it really quickly, which is how I felt growing up. In doing it every week, it was just someone's going to stand up and talk about communion for a second, and then it's pass them, eat it, and then we move on. Whereas what we've been trying to do here at Calvary is plan ahead, weeks ahead of time, that we're going to do communion, that we're going to create that atmosphere of just more worship time, more time for you to actually talk to Jesus, versus thanks, boom, I'm out.
Well, and okay. So for me, the thing that was, I don't want to say monotonous, probably that way, but the thing that scared me, I guess, about communion was just the fact that Paul here kind of says, do not take this in an unworthy manner, right? And I'm guilty of this as a pastor, having hammered this to the congregation, not necessarily here, but other churches. And then mostly because it was hammered at me growing up. And that often is this feeling of, because you're not worthy, you shouldn't take it. You have to be perfect. You have to come to the table already squeaky clean and all those other things. And
it's what's that definition of worthy and unworthy? Whose definition of that are we using? Ours or God's?
Exactly, because the reality is when you look at it, of course we're not worthy.
Oh yeah.
Of course we're not worthy. And if it was by that standard, then none of us would take it. And then that would make it null and void. The fact that Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Do this until I come. Do this until, I come back and we get to be together, right? Yeah. And so for me, it happened a few years ago, because I'm sitting here thinking like, wait a minute, I've been doing communion the wrong way for so long. And then when you look at this passage, the bookends are the fact that there's disunity in the church. Right. And so, of course, because there's disunity in the church, of course, they're going to be taking it the wrong way. And for me, I felt like it almost became kind of like scary to take communion. I have to like, oh no, I got to look around and make sure, Jesus isn't there with a ruler and smacking my hand or whatever. Yeah. And so for me, like, there would be times that wasn't planned or whatever. I'd just go up and I'd see like growing up, we had a table and we would have all the communion elements at the front. Right. I remember coming, I'm like, oh no, I lied, or I did this morning. I can't. And so it takes me away from the message. It takes me away from going there and learning about Jesus, because the reality is I'm making it about me and not remembering what Jesus did for me.
And that's such an interesting distinction, because yes, it is in some way about us, but the entire idea is not about us. Communion is not about us specifically. It's about what Jesus did. And yes, Jesus did it for us. So it is about it. It gets weird in there. It gets interesting. And I'm guilty of it too. Of even just here recently in times that we've done communion, of just being like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm doing this in a worthy manner. And I'm just like, okay, Jesus, I'm sorry for everything that I've done, that I've done since the last time I did this. And it's almost like I'm confessing, like a confessional kind of a thing. But then it's like, yeah, but I have to remember, Jesus, you're good. You've forgiven me, and you know my heart, and I'm saved, which is what we talked about on Sunday, what you talked about on Sunday, that basically the only way to be, quote, worthy of communion is to be saved, is to have given your life to Jesus, because at that point, then his worthiness, his righteousness becomes ours. That's the whole thing, and that's when we become worthy.
And, it's funny, because, like, I had this, like, weird epiphany, too, when I was, just doing communion years ago. And one of the things that really was striking to me is the fact that it's not about my worth. Yes, I should remember. Yes, I should have the right attitude. But then there's also the flip side of, no, we should take this serious. Yeah. If there is like sin that is in my life that I'm, really doing, then yes, obviously I can't take this. My wife and I were talking after the message, because our daughter, she's 6, and she was sitting in the service, and she was asking, can I take communion and all that? And it created an interesting conversation with my wife and I. It's like, okay, when is she ready? When can she? Is she just doing it because she wants to eat that, packing peanut little flat thing? I apologize for anyone that has to take it. It tastes like a packing peanut.
An unflavored Cheeto.
Don't ask why.
Yeah.
Anyway, and the juice, because for her it's like, oh cool, everyone else is doing it, so maybe I should do it. And even as a kid, that's kind of how I felt. It's like, well, I'm just going to do it.
Well, I did too. I remember specifically telling my dad one day, whenever I was real young and we were in a church service and communion was happening, I was asking him if I could have some, and he told me no in that moment because I didn't understand it. And I said, but I'm hungry. I remember that. I remember that day.
I remember I was pastoring at a church, and all the kids at the church would eat all the leftover crackers and the juice at the back of the church, and I'd just be that old fuddy-duddy and just yell like, "Hey, don't do that! That's the Lord's body and blood!" And I'm just sitting there like, why am I yelling? But at the same time, I think for me, the reality is I don't want to make people feel bad for not taking it, but there is that sacredness. There is the reality that this is a serious thing. And so I think finding that balance is the hard thing.
Oh, absolutely. Because, I've been in youth group before. We were at camp years and years ago, and our youth leader wanted to take communion with us, but the only thing that was available were breakfast biscuits and apple juice. But we still took communion, and it still meant exactly what it would always mean, where it's the symbols. And so we did have that sacredness there, but it didn't have to be the church traditional way that we've always done this kind of a thing. So it's like, that's what you're talking about. There's that balance. There's the part of it that doesn't have to be perfectly strict. And then there's the part of it that is also, we should be paying attention to this and caring about this.
Right.
Well, that's really good stuff. Closing thoughts? Closing statements?
I guess, one of the things that I just want to encourage you is just, as it pertains not just to communion, but just to the church at large, are you so focused on yourself, or is there some unity that needs to take place in your life? Right. Unity within your home, unity to your kids, unity at the church, and just, ask God to, help you with that. Because it's, for me, preparing this message, there was a lot of things that I was like, oh, wow, and it wasn't meant to be legalistic in that respect. And so I just want to encourage you guys, like the illustration, coming together as a hand. And so let's be this in the community, be this in our homes, be this in our church, and not like this. So that's my last thought.
Yeah, no, I love it. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us this week for this episode of the Midweek Podcast. Hopefully you've been encouraged. Hopefully you've got some stuff to think about. We certainly do. We're very excited to still be doing this Vision series, bringing this to you guys. Leave us a rating on any podcast platform that you are listening to this on. We'll see you next week. Go back, listen to the other ones. If you missed one, you want to catch up, or go back and listen to season 1. It's kind of a neat thing. It's all still there and available. But thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye.